tiring, for that length of time, but it is. But anyhow, I had that. Then we had the mobile software presentation in the evening, which, with all the excitement, I almost forgot about, And then I had a late class, but I think I've recovered. I was actually up early today, believe it or not, because, and it makes sense in a way. When I got home last night, I was tired, and so I probably went to bed about an hour earlier than I normally do. So I woke up an hour earlier than I normally do, which, while I can appreciate the logic, I kind of think I would have appreciated the extra hour of sleep even more. All right. So anyhow, so that's all we have for class. No, I'm just kidding. Today we're going to talk about the sort of third piece of the puzzle in web development. And obviously, as we are winding down, we can't go into this in great detail. All right, but I do want to introduce this notion to you and show some examples of it and talk about some of the things that we can do. All right, and the final piece of the puzzle in web development, and these are all client-side technologies. That is, they happen inside the browser on the machine. They don't happen on a web server somewhere, but they happen inside the browser, inside the client's browser. The third technology is JavaScript. So taken together, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are sort of the web standard languages. Now there's other things that clients understand as well. For example, almost every machine in the world, well, let me rephrase that, almost every desktop or laptop computer can run Flash in their browser. But that's not really a quote, standard. It's sort of a de facto standard. And when we get to mobile devices, some mobile devices, most notably the Apple ones, don't support Flash. All right. So if we're talking about true standards, I would say the three true standards for web development are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And the first thing I want to do is I want to paint a picture of what JavaScript brings to the table, because I think we should already have a pretty good idea of what HTML and CSS do. All right? And let's see where JavaScript fits into the equation. All right? HTML, if you remember, is responsible for the content of the page and what I'll call the logical structure. All right? So, in other words, what the page means. I guess it's a more abstract way to put it. So what do I mean by that? I mean if there's text, if there are important images, not just images for decoration, but images which are truly part of the content. All right? Or if there if there are links, all these sorts of things are shown in HTML. All right? But in addition to that, we use the HTML tags to sort of group things and to show how they relate to each other and how they mean. For example, we use the div tag to separate our page into sections. That's sort of a logical structure, right? Here's a navigation section. In other words, these 3 or 4 links, or 5 or 6, or however many links, aren't just 5 or 6 links. Logically, they're grouped together. They mean something together. They form a little unit on the page, a little subsection of the page. And the div tag is what explains that, which says, hey, these links, they're part of a section. We talked about many pages having a banner that might have a text and an image. It's not just some random text or a random image. It comprises the banner of the page, and so on down the line. Lists. We don't simply have, strings of text next to each other. We can make an ordered list or an unordered list. That tells us something about that. Yeah, these things are organized a certain way and form a list. All right? That's what we get from HTML. From CSS, we get appearance, and layout. So, we don't use HTML, even though there are some deprecated tags that we could and attributes that we could use, but we don't use HTML to give our page a color, or we don't use HTML to give our page a different font, or different size of text, or anything like that. All of that happens in CSS. So, regardless of whether we can do it in HTML or not, we don't want to. Remember the example that we talked about last time where we showed a mobile version of a web page. All right? In that example, we were able to do that because we separated the meaning from the way it looks. If you can do that successfully, if you can successfully separate the meaning of the page from how it looks, you can then format that page in different ways depending on how someone is viewing it. So you can format it one way for a desktop screen. You can format it another way for a mobile screen. You can format it another way if someone's viewing it versus printing it out. So you get that if the way it looks and the content aren't tangled up together. They're kept separate. You can then substitute one without changing the other. All right? More or less like, let's say you have an iPod. You're listening to music, right? The iPod plays the music. The speaker is where the sound comes out, right? The speaker is a part of the iPod. It's a component that you can plug something else into if you need to. So if you have one of those, if you have those bigger external speakers, you can plug your iPod into the external speakers, and the sound comes out the speakers. If you want to listen just yourself, you plug in your headphones, and you do that. Why? Because they separated into two things. They separated the playing of music, retrieving the music off of the internal memory and playing it, and where the actual sound comes out. All right? And that allows you flexibility. That allows you to hook different things up and listen to it in different ways. You can hook it up in your car. You can hook it up to headphones. You can hook it up to external speakers. So you'll see a lot of things like that, similar to that in IT, where if you keep things separate, that gives you so much more flexibility. All right? In addition to the appearance, like the colors and the fonts and all that, CSS is responsible for the physical layout of the page. And the layout of the page is really connected to the logical structure, but it's really two different things, right? When I define a logical structure, I might be defining different sections of my page. That there's going to be a banner, and there's going to be a navigation, and there's going to be a content area. That's the logical structure of the page. And I do that in HTML via div tags and list tags and using the headings and all that kind of stuff. The physical layout relates to how those things are going to be positioned on the page and how they're going to be laid out. In other words, as we've seen examples of, I could have two pages with the same logical structure that have a very different physical layout. In other words, this page with a banner, navigation, and content, another page could have the identical banner, navigation, and content. These have the same logical structure, right? They have the same, it's broken down the same way, and it's divided and it's structured the same way, but the physical layout is totally different, all right? So, again, by having the separation between HTML and CSS, we achieve that. So now we're ready for the last piece of the puzzle. And the last piece of the puzzle relates to JavaScript. And with JavaScript, we're talking about interactivity. And we are talking about, another way to say it is behavior. Now, before we talked about JavaScript, we're really limited as to the kind of interactivity we can build into our pages. We can do just a little bit with HTML and CSS. I suppose you could call clicking on a link and going to another page interactivity, right? What do I mean by interactivity? I mean the user does something and the page responds. So I guess you could call clicking on a link interactivity, but that's kind of a very clunky form of interactivity. That really doesn't count, all right? Because when we talk about a web page being interactive rather, we're talking about a web page that changes based on what the user does without reloading the whole page, right? So going to another page isn't really interactivity. That's just switching from one page to another. Now we've seen a little bit of interactivity in CSS with the example of the hover pseudo class on a link. In other words, you can put a hover pseudo class on a link, and when you put your mouse over it, you can change the color or change the font or whatever. Yeah, it's a very limited form, but yeah, that's probably more like true interactivity than clicking on a link. But with JavaScript, we can do all sorts of things. All right, let's look at a couple examples where JavaScript is involved. All right, let me call up some websites where JavaScript is involved. Oh. My favorite is when you go to Burger King, you always get that stray onion ring in if you order fries. Oh. You know, that's always like a little. I always take that as like a little bonus. Yeah, oh, yeah. Because I kind of like their onion rings, even though I absolutely despise onions. Believe it or not. It's because there's really I don't think any onions in onion rings from Burger King. I think it's just like, you know, pulverized, deep fried onion remains, you know. Yeah, ew, yeah. But they do taste good, I have to say. All right. Here's an example of some real, meaningful interaction. What? Yeah, it does. Yeah, let's see. Yeah. At least they understand. Yeah, really. Let's see. What can we do? You know, I was going to say, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm just hitting buttons. And it's like, why would it be different if I do the exact same thing? But it did, right? That's why people try. You know, sometimes tech people say, like, well, why'd you try that? You know why? Because it works a certain percentage of the time, right? And now I don't have to worry about calling AV or anything like that. It's like, and this is a confession, I think the statute of limitations has run out on this one because this is an old job, so I can't get in trouble for it. But back at one job I had, we had to, the programmers had to take turns working application support when application support didn't have enough folks there. All right? So, and programmers hated it, right? Because we became programmers so we wouldn't have to talk to people, right? Right? That's a bit of a stereotype and an overstatement. But on the other hand, so anyhow, we would hate doing that. We would hate calling that and would hate dealing with that. And the one trick that programmers would use when they were on application support is to tell people to reboot their computer and try it again. All right. Now this was with not necessarily with PCs, but this was like mini computers where a bunch of people were on it and people were running terminals. So in other words, for them to reboot their computer, they had to go and contact everyone, tell everyone to log off. They might be running a report or something, right? So they'd have to wait till the report is finished or whatever. So it might take an hour or so for them to get around doing that. All right. And in which case, maybe your shift is over. And if the reboot worked, which it did a crazy amount of the time, right? You look like a genius. If not, it's someone else's problem. The other dirty trick that we did would be call people when you are pretty sure they're probably at lunch. I'm calling back about your problem. Oh, you're at lunch at 12 noon? Yeah. I shouldn't say these things, you know. But, you know, hey, that's back when I was young and foolish, all right, as opposed to now when I'm older and foolish. All right. Here's an example of JavaScript. For the online people, the screen wasn't working, so I was just talking to fill time. All right. Notice as we put our mouse over these different links, the page changes. So I put my mouse over sports, I see scores, NFL, Major League Baseball, and so on. Put it over money, I see business news, investing, living, style, decor, local, news, weather, sports, and so on down the line. That's really sort of meaningful interactivity, right? Because if you think about it, if they didn't do that, what would you have to do? All right? One of two things. Either they would have to have a lot of space taken up by these menus, right, and show all the submenus down, or to get to, say, the NFL, you'd first have to click sports and then click NFL. And that kind of adds. And as you're navigating around, that would actually get to be a pain as you were navigating around. So much nicer to say, okay, sports, I'm interested in baseball, there I go. I can get there from the home page or really any page. All right? From the home page anyhow. Okay. So that is some kind of meaningful interactivity. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things. First of all, how long does it take when I put my mouse over this for the menu to change? Yeah, virtually instantaneously. I mean, there's no delay. All right? That tells us something, and that tells us something important. That tells us that this functionality is built on the client level. What do I mean by that? If you look at our little model here of the internet, a client, a server, making requests, the request goes to the server responds back. If we look at that model, we've already talked about how we can have scripts or little programs on this side to do dynamic things, to make the page change. So you might say to yourself, well, maybe this code lives on the server so that when they put their mouse over it, it calls the server and gets a new web page with the new submenu. We're pretty sure that isn't happening now. Why? Because this trip through the internet to the server and back, even though it doesn't take very long, it takes some time, right? And if you notice, this happens instantaneously. Also, if you notice, there's no, like, flicker of the screen. There's no flicker of the screen. So I know it's not reloading the whole page. Let's click refresh to see what it will look like if I try to reload the whole page. So if I click refresh and reload the whole page, notice it takes a second or so. It takes far longer, even on a fast connection like this, than it does to move from page to, or from menu to menu to menu. So that implies that this functionality doesn't happen over here. Server-side scripting does other things. Server-side scripting interacts with databases and user input and that sort of thing. This functionality must live on the client. All right? And if it lives on the client, what does that mean? That means that it comes over with the HTML and the CSS, a third component of JavaScript. Put differently, when I first loaded up this page, I loaded the HTML for the page, I loaded the CSS to make it look that way. I also loaded JavaScript to control the behavior, to tell it, hey, the mouse is on money, I want to see these links. The mouse is on living, I want to see those links. If you think about this further, all this HTML was loaded the first time. All the menus, all the submenus, and all JavaScript is doing is it's changing the CSS to show or hide. Let me rephrase that. Without actually looking at the code, it would be impossible to determine for sure. But in all likelihood, all that HTML was loaded when you loaded the page, and all you are doing is some of the menus are visible, some of the menus are invisible. And we're going in and we're hiding and showing the menus depending on where the user has their mouse, how the user interacts with the page. That really is a good definition of interactivity, at least from the context of web pages. When we talk about a web page being interactive, we're talking about a web page that changes, all right, based on something the user does without going to the web server and getting a new copy of the page. And that's exactly what we have here. Here's a web page that we loaded. That web page changes based on what me as a user do. You know, as I put my mouse over those particular links, the submenus appear and disappear. And it does it without reloading the page. And we know that because there's no blink of the page, there's no refresh. Also, if we look very closely, we don't see anything going on the status line down here. So we know it's not reloading the page. Watch this. Another form of interactivity. As I type, that web page changes. And it changes in such a way that, you know, it shows you the most common search terms based on what you've typed in. So it's interactive, right? It depends based on what I've done. So I type something else in, it shows something else. Now this is a little bit different than the first example. This involves both the client and server. This is what's called Ajax. All right? And what Ajax is, Ajax relates to a particular manner of integrating client code and server code to give some really cool interactive effects. All right? We can do some cool things just in JavaScript. We can do some really cool things using Ajax because Ajax we also have server-side code at our disposal, which means we can do things like, as I type in here, code on the Google web server looks to find the 10 most popular searches that start with PH and returns it to me, and then the client can redraw the page without having to refresh the entire page. All right. That, in a nutshell, is what JavaScript brings to the party. So it adds the ability to make the page interactive, that is, respond to something that a user does without reloading the whole page. All right? There's a couple of things in learning JavaScript. And again, we really only have time to introduce this topic, and but you know, we'll do the best that we can. There's two key things with regards to JavaScript. The first one is you have to be able to point to the thing on the on the page rather that you want to change. All right? In other words, when we look at these menus, we have to be able to point and say, that's the menu I want to set. I want to show. I want to show the living menu. Now I want to show the money menu. Now I want to show the sports menu. So the one thing that we have to do is we have to be able to first point to the thing on the page that we want to change. All right? That is done through what is called the DOM. DOM stands for Document Object Model. All right? The DOM is the way by which we point to something on our web page. Let's say we want to paint a room here in the business building. All right? I might say change the color of that room to yellow. All right? What are you going to say? Well, which room? All right? You have to be able to point at the thing that you want to change. And the way we do it here on campus, you could maybe call the room object model. All right? In other words, every room has a building associated with it, right? BU is a building. And then it has a room number associated with it. So BU 105 is the way to refer to this room. All right? That's the naming convention to point to this room. So if someone asks you, where's your class today, and you say BU 105, they know to come here. You have to be able to point to that. Or if we were saying, let's paint a room, which room do we want to paint? BU 102. We've addressed that page, right? We've addressed that room, and we've been able to point to it. The document object model does a similar thing. So if we want to change the color on a link, we want to make a menu appear or disappear. We want to change anything about the HTML or CSS, we first have to be able to point to it. First have to be able to point to it. If we can point to it, then we can change it. All right? In addition to pointing to the thing that we want to change, we have to be able to point to the specific thing that we want to change about it. For example, I'm not just going to say, do some maintenance in BU 105. I'm going to say something specific. What about the room do I want to change? Do I want to change the carpet? Do I want to paint the walls? Do I want to replace ceiling tiles? So you have to identify and point to the particular attribute of the thing that you want to change. So it's not enough to say redo 105. You have to say redo 105 and repaint it. Or redo 105 and change the carpet. Or both. Both those things are done on web pages via what's called the document object model. So through the document object model, we can point to something on a page and we can say we want to change it. All right? Then the specifics of the JavaScript language allow us to write code to change it to whatever we want it to be. All right? In general speaking, there's 3 pieces to JavaScript that you need to understand. And again, we're just going to introduce these concepts, but the 3 pieces that you need to understand is you need to understand, first of all, events. You then have to understand the DOM, and then you have to understand JavaScript syntax. All right? Each one of these has a role in creating the interactivity. We have to understand, first of all, events in HTML. What are events in HTML? Well, it's actions that users can perform when interacting with the page. All right? And there's several of them, right? I put my mouse on something. That's an event. All right? The user did something. I click on something. That's an event. I type something in a text box. That is an event. All right? All those things, all the ways that the user can interact with the stuff on the page are events. All right? So we have to know how to deal with HTML events. Remember my definition of interactivity. The user does something, the page responds without reloading. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make our HTML smart enough to understand when something has happened that's important to us, that we want to do something for. So that's the first thing. This is actually the easiest one. You know, we can talk about this in 5 minutes, and you'll know 90% of what you'll ever need to know about HTML events. All right? The second piece is the DOM. And again, remember the DOM allows us to point to something specific on the page and to point to a specific attribute of that thing on the page and allows us to then change it via code. Yes?
Would this be pointing towards like a div tag?
Could point to anything on the page. So it could point to a div tag. It could point to a link tag. It could point to an image tag. Just about anything. Pardon me? Lists could point to just about anything on the page. Absolutely. And what's more, not only can it point to that, it can point to a specific attribute to it. So, for example, we could change the text of a link if we wanted to. We could change the URL that a link goes to. We can change all these things because we can point to them, and we use the DOM to do that. The last piece of this JavaScript puzzle is the syntax, and that's knowing the exact JavaScript statements to write using the DOM to do what it is we want to do. All right, we're going to start small, all right, and we're going to build up. What I want to do is I want to make a page that has an image on it that we're going to show and hide. All right. So let me go and I'm going to take one of our old examples and edit it, so this will take a second. All right. All right. Here is a page that just has a picture of one of my cats on it. Very basic. All right. We can pull it up. There it is. All right. Of course, I pick my favorite cat, right? It's my example. I pick whichever cat I want. All right. So, let's see if we can make the cat disappear. All right. Now, how are we going to make the cat disappear? There's a bunch of ways we could do it. I'm going to make it with a button. And I'm not going to send this to the server, so it's not a submit button. Okay? A submit button remembers what that does. That sends your data to the server to be processed. I don't want to do that. I want to use a plain old button, or what I called before a button. So I'm going to use a button that when the user clicks on it, it makes the cat picture disappear. Now, that's a user event, right? the user clicks on the button. That's what's going to get the ball rolling. I then need to be able to point to that picture of the cat and change something about it. Specifically, I want to change something about the visibility of that picture. I think in the example we had last time, we did something with the visibility based on whether it was mobile or a desktop. So here we want to do something with the visibility based on when the user clicks on it. So let's go in and get everything rolling. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my button all right. If you're putting in your notes, leave some space here where it says on click. Now, so what I've done to my page is I've put a button on here that has a value of hide, and I've put on click. That is the HTML events that I talked about. HTML events typically start with the word on. In other words, when the user does this, on this occasion, when the user clicks, do something. When the user puts their mouse over something, do something. When the user types a letter in, do something. We can see all the different events, and they all start with on. And you can see what some of them are. On load, on unload, on blur, on change, on focus, on reset, on select, on submit, on abort, on key press, on key up, on key down. You can actually do something different when they press the key down and then when they lift up their finger. Those are two different events, all right, that behave a little bit differently. And then on click, on mouse down, on mouse over, on mouse out, and so on. So these are the events with a little explanation of them. Now we're not going to necessarily use all these events, but we're going to vary it up a little bit and try a few different events throughout our discussion of JavaScript. But if you want to know what other events are available, again, just Google it and you can look. All right, so there in 5 minutes is pretty much 80% of what you need to know about events. All right, and the rest of it, or the rest of it, you can look online or we'll cover in future examples. So, on click, that's the HTML event that's relevant here. That's what the user's going to do to get the ball rolling. All right. Now, so we have that part taken care of. The other two parts, not so fast. Those get to be very tricky at times. All right. Now, the next thing we have to do is we have to point to the thing on the page that we want to change. Well, what do we want to change? We want to change this image. All right? Now, there's a lot of different ways you can point to something on the page. Just like there's a lot of different ways I could tell you, where my house is. All right? The typical way is to give the address. All right? But I could give you the coordinates of it, the latitude and longitude, and you could find it that way. All right? Or, who knows, maybe, I could say you go on this street and it's the 10th house down without giving you the address. All right? So there's a lot of ways that you could refer to it, but we're going to do the simplest one first. We're going to do like giving the address of it. And that's where we're going to use an ID field. All right? So I'm going to give an ID to this image, and I'm going to say ID equals cat pic. All right, that says what it is. It's a picture of a cat, right? Now, if you remember back when we first started talking about IDs, we said that IDs need to be unique. In other words, I shouldn't have anything else on this page called cat pick, right? Well, at the time, if you didn't follow that, you didn't really suffer any consequences. Here's where you're going to suffer some consequences if you don't follow that. Because it would be like having two houses on the same street that have the same address. You have a $1 million check and a summons to appear in court that you're delivering to 111 Main Street, and there's two houses with that address. Which one gets which? Who knows? All right. There can't be any of that ambiguity. It has to be unique. All right. Now, one way that you can refer to it is by putting this in. And I'm going to put the whole statement in, and then we'll make sure that it works. I haven't made a typo or anything. And then we'll go back and we'll dissect it. All right. All right. I think this is right. Let me test it, because I'd hate to go in a long-winded explanation of why you do this only to find out I made a mistake and it didn't work. Okay, that looks right. Let me save it. Hit refresh. Or bring it up. I click hide. Disappeared. Ooh. How can I bring it back? Well, hitting that ain't going to help, right? Yeah, if I reload, it'll come back. All right. But you can almost guess what the next question I'm going to ask is, right? Let's dissect this now. Let's dissect that code. First of all, notice that there's double quotes. This on-click event is like any other HTML attribute. It has a name of the attribute. In this case, it's the name of an event, an on-click event. And then within double quotes, it has the value of the attribute. Now, in this case, the value of the attribute is a JavaScript instruction that uses the DOM to do something. Now, let's look at what this does. Document. That means I'm looking somewhere on the web page. All right? That's what document means. That's where I'm starting to look for it. We're zeroing in, right, on this. Just like if I was going to give you my address, I might first give the city that I was in. All right? That kind of zeroes you in. If I say I live in Amherst, I don't live in Elyria or Lorraine or Vermilion or anything like that. So document means, hey, we're looking for something on this web page. Now, that might seem obvious. Of course I'm looking. But you can actually do other stuff. You can actually use, through JavaScript, change a page in another window. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. So you do have to identify, yes, the thing that I want to change lives on this page. What is it that I want to look at on this page? I want to find the thing on this page that has an ID of cat pick. All right? Well, what on this page has an ID of cat pick? This right here. So this points to that image. All right? But there's a lot of things I could do with that image. Right? There's a lot of things I could do with that image. What is it that I want to do with it? All right? Well, I want to change something about the way that it looks. So I want to change the style. All right? What do I want to do about the style? I want to change its visibility. What do I want to change its visibility to? I want to change it to hidden. Now, a few things to understand in this statement. I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, JavaScript is case sensitive. So if I make this ID like that, it's not going to work anymore. All right. Second thing is notice how I use the single quotes inside this instruction. All right. Why do I use single quotes inside? Well, the double quotes indicate the start and end of the statement. Therefore, anywhere I need to use quotes, I better use the single quotes. Now, why are those particular things in single quotes? Well, cat pick is the actual value of the ID, not some variable or something. So I have to include that in quotes. Hidden is the actual value that I want to set it to, not the value of some variable or something else. So document, I have to say document if it's on this page. Get element by ID, that's not something I made up. That's built into the DOM. Cat pick is a value I made up, but it corresponds to the ID of the thing I wanted to change. So this has to match that. Then this rest of the stuff, again, is stuff that I didn't make up. That's just your CSS code pointed to in a different way or phrased in a different way. In other words, I could make a CSS rule to make that invisible, and I'd do the same thing in the style rule. I would say visibility : hidden, and that would do the same thing. All I'm doing now is I don't always want it hidden. I want it hidden only under these conditions when I press that button. Yes.
For JavaScript, it's always going to be in the HTML section, never in the CSS.
It won't be in the CSS. It will be, as part of the HTML document, it can be put in its own file, like we did with CSS, and typically the actual JavaScript itself lives in the head section, but this simple first example, we're doing it right here. So, how do you suppose we could make a button to bring back this cat? We can make them disappear. How do you make them come back?
Change it to visible message.
Exactly. We create a button that looks just like this button, except our JavaScript statement is different. Oops. Okay, so I make a new button, onClick equals, still on the web page. I still want to find it using the ID. I still want to change something about its style. I still want to change its visibility, except I don't want the visibility to be hidden. I want the visibility to be visible. No. Again, that's your CSS syntax. The syntax in CSS is visibility : either hidden or visible, and there might be some other options. So we can hide them, we can show them again. Now I'm going to go a little bit over time, but I think it's worth it because this will put you 90% there to be able to do your assignment. All right, and I do want to have a little bit of closure on this. How do you suppose we could change the picture of Simba into a picture of Cleo? I should have wrote it the other way because I'd rather change Cleo into Simba, but that's neither here nor there. Yeah, exactly. What the student said is, I do it the same way. I point to the same image. Oops. But I don't change the visibility attribute. I change the source attribute. This is just another way to set those attributes of our HTML tags. But instead of building it into the HTML, we build it into the JavaScript. So I can say, change, onClick, document, get element by ID, cat pick. Not changing the style anymore. I'm actually changing the SRC attribute of it. SRC is an HTML attribute, not a CSS attribute. So How do I know it's SRC? Because that's what you call it when you create the image. And I want to change the value from Simba to Clio. Okay. And then we can change them back. All right. So let's look at this. Can change it to Clio. We can hide it. What's it going to look like when we show it? It's going to still be Clio. Change it to Simba. Hide it. Change to Clio. Change the Simba. Show it. And there you go. All right. Now, to be sure, there's tons more to JavaScript. But kind of the formula that I laid out of events to trigger the action, to get the ball rolling, the DOM to point to something on the page that we want to change, and then finally the JavaScript syntax to actually change that, allows us to do that interactivity. Again, we're changing the same attributes that we put in our HTML and CSS to begin with, or could have put in there. All right? Just one last one, because this always gets some laughs. We can make the picture bigger. Pardon me? One laugh, yeah. Oh, come on. Tough crowd. Wow, we got a tough crowd today. We could say something like, there we go. Okay, that wasn't very funny. Oh, well, no wonder. Okay, so it's that big. We click Make Bigger and do that. We can actually, what really gets the big laughs, I'm going to save until next week to make it come back. All right?
Now, if you change Clio, will it go back small or will it stay large?
If I change the Clio, what do you think?
I assume it will stay large.
It'll stay large because I've set the property of that image tag. And now I'm going to change another property of that image tag to swap the image so we get big evil Clio. She's watching you guys.
Is she still alive?
You should have seen how your face changed when that picture showed.
I'm sure. Yeah, totally subconscious. No, she's not still alive, but I have my doubts. You know, she might come back to haunt me. I don't know, but yeah, she's presumed dead. Let's put it that way. Yeah. All right. Next week we're going to do some more stuff with this and get a little more involved in this. But everything we do is going to be just extending that basic concept to just more and more stuff. All right. We'll see you over in lab.
I can just see it now watching it online. They used to watch the videos from NORAD's class on my 52-inch. I can just see that coming up on my
Big old Clio, yeah.